She had always been there, yet somehow never truly seen. In crowded rooms, she blended into the background like a shadow that no one noticed. At school, she sat quietly in the middle rows, never causing trouble, never demanding attention. Teachers rarely called on her unless there was no one else left. Classmates remembered louder voices, brighter personalities, and confident laughter, but not her. It wasn't that she didn't exist. It just felt like she didn't matter. Her days followed a quiet pattern. She would wake up early, get ready without making noise, and leave the house while everything still felt calm. The morning air was often her favorite part of the day. It was peaceful, almost like the world hadn't yet decided who to notice and who to ignore. During those moments, she felt a little lighter, as if she belonged somewhere, even if only for a short while. But once she reached school, that feeling faded. Groups of students gathered in corners, laughing loudly and sharing stories. Some people always seemed to be at the center of attention, surrounded by friends who listened to every word they said. She would walk past them quietly, her presence barely acknowledged. Even when she stood close enough to hear their conversations, it felt like there was an invisible wall between her and everyone else. Sometimes she tried to join in. She would wait for the right moment, thinking carefully about what to say. But before she could speak, someone else would jump in, and the conversation would move on without her. After a while, she stopped trying. It was easier to stay silent than to feel ignored again and again. In class, it wasn't much different. When group projects were assigned, she often ended up doing small, unnoticed tasks. Others took the lead, made decisions, and spoke for the group. She followed instructions, completed her part, and stayed quiet. When the project was finished, the credit usually went to the more outspoken members. No one asked for her thoughts. No one wondered what she might be capable of. Even during lunch breaks, she kept to herself. While others shared meals and stories, she found a quiet spot where she could sit alone. Sometimes she watched people from a distance, observing how easily they connected with one another. It wasn't jealousy she felt, it was more like confusion. She didn't understand how it came so naturally to them. There were moments when she questioned herself. Maybe she wasn't interesting enough. Maybe she didn't have anything worth saying. These thoughts didn't come all at once. They grew slowly over time, shaped by countless small moments of being overlooked. Each time someone talked over her, each time her presence went unnoticed, it added to a quiet belief that she didn't stand out in any way. At home, things were calmer, but not very different. Everyone had their own routines and responsibilities. Conversations were short and practical, mostly about daily tasks. She helped where she could, keeping things running smoothly without drawing attention to herself. It wasn't that anyone meant to ignore her. It just happened naturally, like she had become part of the background of everyday life. In the evenings, she often sat by the window, watching the world outside slowly quiet down. Streetlights flickered on, and distant sounds faded into silence. These were the moments when her thoughts felt the loudest. She wondered what it would feel like to be noticed, not in a big, dramatic way, but simply to be seen and understood. There was something inside her, something she couldn't quite explain. It wasn't loud or demanding. It was quiet, like a soft voice waiting patiently. She didn't know exactly what it meant, but she felt it whenever she was alone. It gave her a sense that there was more to her than what others saw, or rather, didn't see. One afternoon, after another ordinary day, she returned home and moved through the house as quietly as usual. The rooms felt familiar, almost too familiar, like they held the same silence she carried with her. She placed her bag down and paused for a moment, listening to the stillness around her. That's when her eyes drifted toward something in the corner of the room. It was an old piano, slightly worn, its surface showing signs of age. It had been there for as long as she could remember, yet it rarely caught anyone's attention. Most people passed by it without a second glance, treating it as just another piece of furniture. But for some reason, she stopped. She walked closer, her steps slow and uncertain, as if she were approaching something unfamiliar. The piano didn't look special to anyone else, but to her, it felt different in that moment. It stood quietly, much like her, unnoticed and waiting. She reached out and gently touched one of the keys. The sound that followed was soft, simple, and brief. Yet it lingered in the air longer than she expected. It wasn't loud or impressive, but it felt real. More real than anything she had experienced that day. She hesitated, then pressed another key. This time, the sound seemed to settle somewhere deeper inside her. It was hard to explain, but it felt like something had shifted. The quiet voice she had always felt within her seemed to respond, growing slightly clearer. She sat down slowly, her fingers hovering over the keys. There was no plan, no expectation. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. There was no one there to see. For once, she didn't have to worry about being ignored or judged. She pressed a few more keys, one after another. The sounds weren't perfect. Some notes didn't quite match, and the rhythm wasn't steady. But none of that mattered. For the first time in a long while, she felt something she couldn't describe. A sense of expression, as if she was speaking in a language that didn't require words. Minutes passed without her noticing. The world outside faded, and the quiet room seemed to come alive with each note. It wasn't about skill or performance. It was about feeling. Something she had kept hidden for so long without even realizing it. When she finally stopped, the silence returned, but it felt different now. It wasn't empty. It was calm, almost comforting. She looked at the piano again, her fingers resting lightly on the keys. In that moment, she didn't feel invisible. It was a small change, barely noticeable to anyone else, but it meant something to her. She didn't fully understand it yet, but she knew one thing for sure. There was more inside her than the world had ever seen. And for the first time, she began to wonder what would happen if that hidden part of her was given a chance to be heard. The next day felt almost the same as every other day, but something inside her had quietly changed. It wasn't something others could see. Her walk was still soft, her voice still low, and her presence still easy to overlook. But deep within her, there was a small spark that hadn't been there before. She carried that feeling with her as she went through her usual routine. At school, the noise and chatter filled the halls just like always. Groups formed, conversations overlapped, and laughter echoed in every corner. No one noticed her as she passed by, and in a way that was still familiar. But this time she didn't feel as empty as before. Her mind kept drifting back to the piano. The memory of those simple notes stayed with her throughout the day. It wasn't about how they sounded, it was about how they made her feel. For the first time, she had found something that didn't require her to compete for attention or struggle to be heard. It simply allowed her to exist. During class, while others focused on their work or whispered to each other, she found herself tapping her fingers lightly on the desk. The rhythm was quiet, almost unnoticeable, but it followed a pattern. She didn't even realize she was doing it at first. It just came naturally, like her hands remembered something her mind was still trying to understand. When the final bell rang, students rushed out, eager to return to their lives outside. She walked home at her usual pace, neither fast nor slow. But there was a quiet anticipation building inside her. It wasn't excitement in a loud, obvious way. It was more like a gentle pull, guiding her back to something she didn't fully understand yet. As soon as she reached home, she went through her routine quickly, finishing what needed to be done. Her movements were still careful and quiet, but there was a sense of purpose behind them now. And when she was finally alone, her eyes turned toward the piano again. It was still there, unchanged, waiting just as it had been the day before. She approached it slowly, almost as if she were afraid the feeling might disappear if she moved too quickly. Sitting down, she placed her fingers on the keys, pausing for a moment before pressing the first note. The sound filled the room once again. This time she didn't hesitate as much. She let her fingers move a little more freely, pressing one key after another. The notes didn't follow any formal structure, but they weren't random either. They seemed to come from somewhere deeper, guided by her thoughts and emotions rather than any learned pattern. First, it was simple. A few notes repeated slowly. Then, without realizing it, she began to change the pace. Some notes came quicker, others slower. There was a rhythm forming, not perfect, but real. She stayed there for a long time, Each time she played, she discovered something new. A different sound. A different feeling. It was like exploring a place she had never seen before, even though it had always been right in front of her. Days passed, and this quiet habit became part of her life. No one noticed. At school, she remained the same in everyone's eyes. Still quiet, still overlooked, still someone who blended into the background. But inside, something was growing. Every evening, she returned to the piano, spending more time with it than the day before. She didn't tell anyone. It wasn't because she wanted to keep it a secret. It was because she didn't know how to explain it. How do you describe something that feels like a part of you that no one has ever seen? Something that doesn't need words to exist? There were moments when she made mistakes. Notes that didn't sound right. Rhythms that felt off. But instead of stopping, she kept going. There was no pressure, no expectation. No one was there to judge her or correct her. For once, she was allowed to learn in her own way. And slowly, she began to improve. Her fingers moved with more confidence. The pauses between notes became more intentional. The sounds started to connect, forming something that felt complete. It wasn't just random anymore. It was becoming music. One evening, as she played, she closed her eyes. Without the distraction of sight, everything felt stronger. The sound, the movement, the emotion. It all came together in a way she hadn't experienced before. Her hands moved more freely, as if they were no longer guided by doubt. In that moment, she forgot about everything else. She forgot about being ignored. She forgot about the quiet spaces she occupied in other people's lives. None of it mattered while she was playing. Here, she wasn't invisible. Here, she had a voice. When she opened her eyes, the room was the same, but she wasn't. There was a sense of calm in her expression. Something steady and grounded. It wasn't confidence in the way people usually describe it. It was quieter than that. But it was real. The piano had become more than just an instrument. It was her space. Her way of expressing what she couldn't say out loud. Her way of being seen, even if no one else was there to witness it. At school, small changes began to show, though no one paid much attention to them. She still didn't speak much, but she listened differently now. She noticed patterns in conversations, the rhythm in people's voices, the rise and fall of their words. It was almost like everything around her had its own kind of music, and she was starting to understand it. One day, during a group activity, something unexpected happened. The group was struggling to organize their ideas. Everyone was talking at once, trying to take control, but nothing was coming together. She sat quietly, observing as usual. But this time, instead of staying completely silent, she spoke. Her voice was soft, but steady. She suggested a simple way to arrange their ideas, breaking things into smaller parts. It wasn't anything complicated, but it worked. The group paused, listening just long enough to understand. And for a brief moment, they followed her suggestion. It didn't turn into a big moment. No one praised her or made a big deal out of it. Soon, the conversation moved on, and things went back to normal. But for her, it mattered. It was a small step, almost invisible to others, but it showed her something important. The quiet voice inside her wasn't as weak as she once believed. It just needed the right way to be heard. That evening, when she returned to the piano, something felt different again. She played with a little more confidence. The hesitation in her movements had lessened. The music flowed more naturally, carrying a sense of purpose that hadn't been there before. She didn't realize it yet, but she was changing. Not in a loud, noticeable way that would suddenly make everyone turn and look at her, but in a deeper, more meaningful way. The kind of change that starts quietly and grows stronger over time. And even though the world still overlooked her, she was beginning to see herself differently. For the first time, she wasn't just existing in the background of her own life. She was becoming something more. The days continued to pass quietly, but the change inside her kept growing. It wasn't loud or obvious, and from the outside, nothing about her life seemed different. She still walked the same halls, sat in the same seat, and kept to herself most of the time. People still overlooked her, speaking around her as if she were part of the background. But something had shifted deep within her. Every evening, she returned to the piano. What had started as simple curiosity had now become something she depended on. It was no longer just about pressing random keys. Her fingers had begun to understand where to go, even without thinking too much. The notes connected more smoothly, and the sounds carried more emotion. Sometimes, she didn't even realize how much time had passed. What felt like a few minutes often turned into hours. The outside world would fade, and all that remained was the quiet room and the music filling it. One evening, as she played, she noticed something new. The music was beginning to tell a story. It wasn't something she had learned or practiced in a formal way. It just happened. Certain notes felt soft and calm, while others carried a sense of longing. Some parts felt uncertain, like a question waiting for an answer. And then there were moments where everything came together, strong and clear. It reminded her of her own thoughts and feelings. For so long, she had struggled to express herself with words. But now, without speaking at all, she was saying more than she ever had before. The school life went on as usual. But then, one day, something unexpected happened. An announcement was made during the morning. There was going to be a small event at the end of the week. It wasn't anything big or formal, just a simple gathering where students could share their talents. Some would sing, some would speak, and a few would perform different acts. The moment the announcement ended, excitement spread through the room. People immediately started talking about what they would do. Some were confident, already planning their performances. Others laughed and joked, encouraging each other to take part. Names were mentioned, ideas were shared, and energy filled the space. She listened quietly as always. No one looked at her. No one asked if she wanted to join, and that was expected. She had never been the kind of person people imagined on a stage. She had never volunteered for anything like this before. In their eyes, she simply wasn't someone who would perform. At first, she didn't think much about it. It was just another event, another moment where she would sit in the audience and watch others be seen. That had always been her role, and part of her had accepted it long ago. But later that day, something stayed on her mind. As she sat in class, trying to focus, her thoughts kept drifting back to the piano. The music she played every evening, the feeling it gave her, the way it allowed her to express herself without fear. It all came rushing back. For the first time, a quiet question formed in her mind. What if? She didn't let the thought stay for long. Felt too big, too unfamiliar. The idea of standing in front of others, of being seen and heard, was something she had never done before. It didn't feel like something meant for her, so she pushed the thought aside. When she returned home that evening, she sat at the piano as usual. Her fingers rested on the keys, but for a moment, she didn't play. The question came back. What if? This time it stayed longer. She pressed a key, then another. The sound filled the room, soft and steady. As she continued playing, her thoughts began to mix with the music. The hesitation, the fear, the curiosity, it all became part of the rhythm. She imagined what it would be like, standing in front of people, sitting at a piano, letting them hear what she had kept hidden for so long. Her hands slowed. The idea felt both exciting and frightening at the same time. She had grown comfortable in her quiet world, where no one judged her and no one expected anything from her. Stepping out of that space meant risking something she wasn't sure she was ready for. What if she made a mistake? What if people didn't care? What if they still overlooked her, even after everything? Her fingers paused completely. The silence in the room felt heavier than before. She looked down at the keys, unsure of what to do next. For a moment, doubt began to take over. It reminded her of all the times she had been ignored, all the moments where her voice hadn't mattered. Maybe it was better to stay where she was, safe, unnoticed, comfortable in her own quiet way. But then, slowly, she pressed another key. The sound was clear. It cut through the silence in a way that felt different, stronger. She played another note, then another. This time, there was less hesitation. The music began to build again, carrying a quiet determination with it. She didn't have all the answers. She didn't know how things would turn out. But one thing was becoming clear. The piano wasn't just something she played in private anymore. It had become a part of her, something real and meaningful, and keeping it hidden felt harder than before. The next day at school, the event was still the main topic of conversation. More people had signed up. Names were being added to a list. Some were practicing openly, showing off their skills and getting attention from others. She watched from a distance. Her mind felt restless. The question hadn't left her. If anything, it had grown stronger. During a break, she found herself standing near the sign-up sheet. Students walked past, writing their names confidently. Some hesitated but eventually added themselves to the list anyway. There was a sense of excitement in the air, a willingness to be seen, even if it meant taking a risk. She stood there for a moment. No one noticed her. Her eyes moved over the names already written down. Each one represented someone who had decided to step forward, to show a part of themselves to others. Her hand slowly lifted. Then it stopped. A wave of doubt rushed in again. This wasn't her place. That's what she had always believed. She wasn't like the others. She didn't have the confidence they had, the presence that drew attention. Her hand lowered. She turned away, ready to leave. But after taking a few steps, she stopped. Something inside her didn't want to walk away this time. She stood still, her heart beating a little faster than usual. It wasn't fear alone. It was something mixed with it. Something that pushed her to turn back. Slowly, she walked toward the sheet again. Her hand reached out once more. This time she didn't stop. She picked up the pen, her fingers slightly trembling, and wrote her name. It wasn't bold or confident handwriting, but it was there. For a moment, she just looked at it. Her name among the others felt unreal. No one around her reacted. No one suddenly turned to look at her. The world didn't change in an instant, but for her, everything felt different. She stepped back, taking a quiet breath. There was no turning back now. For the first time in her life, she had chosen to step out of the background. And even though no one had noticed yet, something important had already begun. The day of the event arrived faster than she expected. All week, she had carried a quiet mix of emotions inside her. There were moments when she felt calm, almost certain that she had made the right decision. But there were also moments when doubt returned, whispering that she didn't belong there. That morning felt different from her usual routine. The air seemed heavier, and even the smallest sounds felt louder than usual. As she got ready, her movements were slower, more careful. She wasn't just preparing for another ordinary day. She was stepping into something she had never done before. When she reached school, the atmosphere was filled with excitement. Students gathered in small groups, talking about the event. Some were rehearsing their lines, others humming songs under their breath. There was laughter, nervous energy, and a sense of anticipation in the air. She walked through it all quietly as she always did. No one stopped her. No one asked her what she would be doing. It was as if her name on the list had gone unnoticed, just like everything else about her. Part of her expected that, but another part of her felt strangely relieved. It gave her space to move forward without pressure from others. This moment was hers, even if no one else realized it yet. As the time for the event came closer, students began to gather in the hall. Chairs were arranged in rows, and a small stage had been set up at the front. The piano stood there, simple and still, waiting. Her eyes found it immediately. It looked different now, not because it had changed, but because of where it was. On that stage, in front of everyone, it felt larger somehow, more important. She took a seat in the audience, blending in as she always had. One by one, students went up to perform. Some were confident, speaking clearly and making people laugh. Others were nervous but still managed to finish what they had prepared. The audience responded with claps, cheers, and encouragement. She watched quietly, her hands resting in her lap. With each performance, her heart began to beat a little faster. The moment she had been thinking about all week was getting closer. There was no way to avoid it now. Her name would be called. She tried to focus on her breathing, keeping it steady. The noise around her started to fade as her thoughts grew louder. What if she forgot what to play? What if her hands didn't move the way they usually did? What if everyone just sat there, uninterested? The questions came one after another, making it harder to stay calm. She looked toward the piano again. It stood there quietly, just as it always had. It didn't look intimidating. It didn't demand anything from her. It simply waited, and somehow that helped. She reminded herself of all the evenings she had spent playing in silence. All the moments where the music came naturally, without fear or doubt. Those moments were real. They hadn't disappeared. The only difference now was the audience. Her name was called. For a brief second, everything felt still. She didn't move right away. The sound of her name echoed in her mind, almost unreal. But then slowly, she stood up. No one reacted strongly. A few people glanced in her direction, curious but not particularly interested. To them, she was still the quiet girl who rarely spoke. She walked toward the stage, each step steady but careful. The distance felt longer than it actually was. The sound of her footsteps seemed louder than usual, even though the room was filled with noise. She could feel eyes on her now, but not in a way that felt overwhelming, more like quiet curiosity. When she reached the stage, she paused for a moment. Then she sat down at the piano. Up close, it felt familiar again. The same keys, the same shape, the same quiet presence she had come to know so well. The noise of the room faded slightly as she placed her fingers gently on the keys. She didn't look at the audience. Instead, she focused on the piano. Her hands rested there for a second longer, as if waiting for the right moment to begin. Then she pressed the first key. The sound was soft. At first, it didn't seem to change anything. The room still held its usual energy. A few people shifted in their seats. Some were still whispering quietly. But she continued. The second note followed, then the third. Her movements were slow at the beginning, careful and steady. She wasn't rushing. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She was simply playing just as she had done so many times before. Something began to shift. The notes started to connect, forming a gentle rhythm. It wasn't loud or dramatic, but it carried a certain feeling, calm, thoughtful, and real. A few people looked up. The whispers in the room began to fade, almost without anyone noticing. The sound of the piano started to fill the space in a way that felt different from the performances before. She continued playing. With each note, her confidence grew. Her hands moved more freely now, no longer held back by hesitation. The music began to flow, building slowly, carrying emotion with it. It wasn't perfect, but it didn't need to be. It was honest. The room grew quieter. More heads turned toward the stage. The same people who had barely noticed her before were now paying attention. Not because they expected something great, but because something about the music drew them in. She still didn't look up. Her focus remained on the piano, on the sound, on the feeling that guided her hands. The fear that had filled her mind earlier began to fade, replaced by something stronger. She wasn't thinking about the audience anymore. She was simply playing. The music grew deeper, more expressive. It carried a sense of longing, then shifted into something lighter, almost hopeful. Each change felt natural, like a conversation that didn't need words. The room was completely silent now. No whispers, no movement, just the sound of the piano. For the first time, she could feel it. People were listening, not just hearing the notes, but truly listening. Her hands continued to move across the keys, steady and sure. The nervousness that had once controlled her was gone. In its place was a quiet confidence, the same feeling she had experienced when she played alone. But this time she wasn't alone, and yet it felt just as real. The final part of her piece approached. The music slowed, becoming softer, more delicate. Each note lingered slightly longer, as if holding on to the moment. Then, with one last gentle movement, she played the final note. The sound faded into silence. For a second, nothing happened. The room remained still, as if everyone needed a moment to process what they had just heard. She slowly lifted her hands from the keys. Her heart was beating again, but not from fear. It felt different now, lighter, calmer. She looked up, and for the first time she saw them. The audience. Not as a distant crowd, but as people who were looking directly at her. Really looking. It was a moment she had never experienced before. The quiet girl who had always been overlooked was no longer invisible. And even before a single clap was heard, everything had already changed. For a few seconds after the final note faded, the room stayed completely still. It was the kind of silence that didn't feel empty. It felt full, as if everyone was holding on to the moment, unsure of what to do next. She sat there quietly, her hands resting near the keys. Her breathing was slow, but her heart was still catching up with everything that had just happened. A part of her wondered if she had imagined it all, the silence, the attention, the feeling that filled the room. Then it happened. A single clap broke through the stillness. It was followed by another and then another. Within moments, the entire room filled with applause. The sound grew louder and stronger, echoing through the hall in a way she had never experienced before. She froze for a second. Not because she was afraid, but because she didn't know how to react. This kind of attention was unfamiliar to her. It wasn't something she had prepared for. She slowly stood up from the piano. The applause continued. Some people even stood from their seats, clapping with more energy than before. A few exchanged surprised looks, as if they were trying to understand how someone they had barely noticed could create something so powerful. She looked out at them again. This time, the expressions were different. There was no indifference, no casual glances or distracted attention. Instead, she saw something she had never seen directed toward her before. Genuine appreciation. It felt overwhelming, but not in a negative way. It was new, unexpected, and hard to fully understand. She gave a small, quiet nod, unsure of what else to do, and then stepped away from the piano. As she walked off the stage, the applause slowly faded behind her, but the feeling stayed. Each step felt lighter, as if something heavy she had been carrying for years had quietly lifted. Back in the audience area, things were no longer the same. People who had never spoken to her before were now looking at her differently. Some leaned toward each other, whispering, but not in the usual way. Their curiosity felt real this time. A few students even turned in their seats to look at her directly. She wasn't used to that. For so long, she had been the one observing others from a distance. Now it was the other way around. She sat down again, trying to steady herself. Her hands were still slightly trembling, but it wasn't from fear anymore. It was from the rush of everything she had just experienced. For the rest of the event, she barely heard the other performances. Her mind kept replaying the moment she had just lived through. The sound of the piano, the silence of the room, the sudden applause. It all felt unreal, like something that had happened to someone else. But it hadn't. It had happened to her. When the event finally ended, the hall slowly began to empty. Students gathered in groups again, talking about their favorite performances. Laughter returned, along with the usual noise. But this time there was a difference. As she stood up to leave, someone approached her. It was a small, simple moment, but it felt significant. The person hesitated for a second, as if unsure how to start the conversation. Then, in a quiet but clear voice, they said that her performance was really good. She didn't know what to say at first. Words had never been her strongest way of expressing herself. But after a brief pause, she gave a small thank you. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Soon, another person came up to her, saying something similar. Then another. The conversations were short and simple, but each one carried meaning. These were people who had never spoken to her before. People who had walked past her countless times without noticing her presence. And now they were stopping. Not because they had to, but because they wanted to. Felt strange, but also warm in a way she couldn't fully explain. She didn't suddenly become someone loud or outgoing. She didn't start talking endlessly or seeking attention. That wasn't who she was. But she didn't shrink away either. She stayed present, listening, responding in her own quiet way. For the first time, she wasn't trying to disappear. As she walked home that day, everything around her felt a little different. The streets were the same. The buildings hadn't changed. The sounds of the world moved on as usual. But her perspective had shifted. She noticed things she hadn't paid attention to before. The rhythm of footsteps on the pavement, the distant hum of voices, the gentle movement of the wind. It all felt connected somehow, like the same quiet music she had discovered within herself. When she reached home, she paused for a moment before going inside. The house looked the same as always, calm and familiar. She stepped in and moved through the rooms quietly, just as she always had. Nothing here had changed either. No one rushed to ask her about her day. No one knew what had happened. And that was okay. She didn't feel the need to explain it right away. Instead, she went to the piano. She sat down, placing her fingers gently on the keys. For a moment, she just stayed there, letting the silence settle around her. Felt different now, not empty, but peaceful. Then she began to play. The sound that filled the room was softer than before, more reflective. It carried a sense of calm, as if she was processing everything she had just experienced. The music wasn't about proving anything anymore. It wasn't about being seen or heard by others. It was about understanding herself. Each note felt more certain, more grounded. The hesitation that once shaped her playing was almost gone. In its place was something steady and real. She realized something as she played. The piano hadn't changed who she was. It had revealed who she had always been. The quietness, the sensitivity, the way she observed the world. None of it was weakness. It was part of her strength. Something that allowed her to feel deeply and express it in a way others could understand. She had spent so much time thinking she needed to be different to be noticed. But she didn't. She just needed to be seen. And now, for the first time, that had happened. As the music continued, a small, genuine smile appeared on her face. It wasn't because of the applause or the attention. It was because she finally felt connected to herself. The world might still be loud and fast, filled with people who spoke over each other and competed for attention. But she didn't feel lost in it anymore. She had found her own way to exist within it. And that made all the difference. When she finished playing, she didn't rush to leave the piano. She stayed there for a while, letting the final notes settle into the quiet room. Outside, the evening slowly turned into night. Inside, everything felt calm. She didn't know what would happen next. She didn't know if people would continue to notice her, or if things would slowly return to the way they were before. But one thing was certain. She was no longer invisible to herself. And that was something no one could take away. The days that followed felt unfamiliar, but not uncomfortable. It wasn't a sudden, dramatic change where everything in her life turned upside down. The world didn't become louder, and she didn't become a completely different person overnight. But something steady had shifted, and it stayed with her. When she returned to school the next morning, the same halls greeted her, filled with the same voices and movements. For a moment, it almost felt like nothing had changed at all. But as she walked through the corridor, she noticed small differences. A few people looked at her a little longer than usual. It wasn't the quick, passing glance she was used to. This time, there was recognition in their eyes. Some even gave small nods or quiet smiles as she passed. It wasn't overwhelming, but it was new. She didn't react strongly. She simply returned the gestures in her own way, with a small, calm expression. In class, things began to shift as well. When the teacher asked a question, there was a brief pause before choosing someone to answer. For the first time, her name was called without it being the last option. It caught her off guard, but she answered quietly, just as she always would have. The difference was in how people listened. No one interrupted. No one spoke over her. The room stayed still until she finished. It was a small moment, but it carried meaning. She didn't suddenly start raising her hand more often or speaking loudly. That wasn't who she was. But she no longer felt like her voice didn't matter. The change wasn't just around her. It was within her. She walked a little more steadily, not faster or slower, but with a sense of quiet presence. She didn't feel the need to shrink herself or disappear into the background anymore. Even in silence, she felt like she belonged. During breaks, something else began to happen. A few people started sitting near her. At first, the conversations were simple. Small comments about school, about the event, about how unexpected her performance had been. She listened, responding when she felt comfortable. The interactions weren't long or deep, but they were real, and that was enough. She didn't try to become someone else to keep their attention. She stayed the same, calm, thoughtful, and observant. And slowly, people began to understand her in that way. One afternoon, someone asked her a simple question. How long had she been playing? She paused for a moment before answering. She didn't have a clear number. She hadn't been trained for years or practiced in a structured way. Her journey with the piano had been quiet and personal, something that grew slowly over time. So she gave a simple answer. Not very long. The person seemed surprised, but also impressed. They didn't question her further. They just nodded, as if accepting that some things didn't need long explanations. That moment stayed with her. It made her realize that she didn't need a perfect story or a long history to justify what she could do. What mattered was what she felt and what she created. At home, her routine remained mostly the same. She still moved quietly through the house, still kept to herself during most of the day. But the evenings had taken on a deeper meaning. The piano was no longer just a place where she escaped. It had become a place where she grew. Each time she sat down to play, she explored something new. Sometimes the music was soft and calm, reflecting her peaceful moments. Other times, it carried more energy, expressing thoughts she didn't even realize she had. She began to notice how her emotions shaped the way she played. On days when she felt unsure, the music sounded slower, more careful. On days when she felt steady, the notes flowed with more confidence. It was like a quiet conversation between her and the piano, one that didn't require words to be understood. One evening, as she played, she remembered the moment on stage. The silence before the applause. The way people had listened. The feeling of being seen. It no longer felt distant or unreal. It felt like a part of her story now, something she could carry forward instead of questioning. She realized something important. Being noticed wasn't about becoming louder or changing who she was. It was about allowing what was already inside her to be heard. And she had done that. Days turned into weeks, and the small changes continued. She became more comfortable in conversations, even if she didn't speak much. People respected her space, and in return, she felt more open to being present. The quiet girl who once faded into the background was still quiet. But she was no longer invisible. There was a difference between the two, and she understood it now. One afternoon, the idea of performing again came up. It wasn't a formal event this time, just a simple suggestion during a discussion about future activities. A few people mentioned her, asking if she would play again. She didn't answer right away. The thought didn't scare her the way it once would have. Instead, it made her think. Not about whether she could do it, but about whether she wanted to. That was new. For so long, her decisions had been shaped by fear and doubt. Now, she was thinking from a place of choice. After a moment, she gave a small nod. Yes. The response was simple, but it carried confidence. There was no rush of nerves, no overwhelming fear. Just a quiet acceptance of the opportunity. Later that day, as she walked home, she felt a calm sense of clarity. Her life wasn't perfect. Not everything had changed. There were still moments of quiet, moments where she preferred to stay in her own space. But she no longer saw those moments as a weakness. They were part of who she was, and they gave her strength. When she reached home, she went to the piano once again. She sat down, her fingers resting gently on the keys. For a moment, she didn't play. She simply listened to the silence. Then slowly she began. The music that filled the room was different from before. It carried everything she had experienced. The quiet beginnings, the uncertainty, the courage to step forward, and the calm that followed. It wasn't just practice anymore. It was expression. It was identity. Each note felt meaningful, connected to something real within her. The sound didn't need to be loud to be powerful. It didn't need to be perfect to be beautiful. It just needed to be honest. As the music continued, she closed her eyes for a moment. Not to escape the world, but to feel it more clearly. When she opened them again, nothing around her had changed. The same room, the same piano, the same quiet evening. But she was different, and that difference would stay with her, not just in moments of music, but in everything she chose to do moving forward. She finished playing, letting the final note fade gently into the silence. This time, the silence felt complete. Not empty, not lonely, just peaceful. She stood up slowly, taking one last look at the piano. It had always been there, waiting quietly, just like she had. But now, both of them had been heard. And that made all the difference.